Clint Eastwood walked into his own restaurant unnoticed until he heard a waitress crying. What happened next left the whole room silent. The night was winding down in Carmel by the sea, the kind of town where faces were familiar and strangers rarely went unnoticed. The glow from the streetlights cast long shadows along the sidewalk, stretching toward the entrance of a modest but well-loved restaurant, Mission Ranch, a place with history, charm, and most importantly, Clint Eastwood's name above the door. But tonight there were no flashing cameras or hushed whispers about Hollywood royalty. No one expected him to be here. Clint Eastwood had always been a man who valued hard work and respect. At 94, he still carried himself with quiet authority, a presence that could shift the air in a room without a word. He hadn't planned on stopping by the restaurant tonight. It was an impulse, an old habit of checking in. Seeing things as they were when no one knew he was watching. As he stepped inside, the familiar atmosphere wrapped around him. The soft clinking of glasses, the murmur of conversations, the low hum of a piano drifting from the corner. The scent of sizzling steak and fresh sourdough bread filled the air, blending with the faint saltiness of the ocean beyond the windows. The place was full, but not chaotic, just the right level of energy for a late evening crowd. He didn't make a show of his presence. No grand entrance, no clearing of throats or shifting glances. Dressed in a well-worn jacket and dark slacks, he moved with an ease that let him disappear into the background. Just another old-timer looking for a quiet seat. But then something stopped him cold. A sound soft but unmistakable. It wasn't the usual clatter of a busy restaurant or the occasional raised voice of a lively guest. It was something far more out of place. A muffled sob. Clint's gaze sharpened. He turned his head slightly, following the sound toward the far side of the dining area, just beyond the swinging doors to the kitchen. Tucked near the service station, half hidden by a partition, stood a young waitress. She had her back to the room, her hands gripping the counter. Her shoulders shook as she took deep, uneven breaths. Trying to pull herself together. She was crying. She wasn't making a scene. She wasn't asking for attention. In fact, she was trying desperately not to be noticed. But Clint had noticed. He stayed where he was for a moment, watching as she wiped her face quickly, inhaled sharply, and straightened up. A mask of forced composure slipped into place, the kind of expression a person wears when they've swallowed their pride too many times. Something about it sat wrong with him. He wasn't the kind to pry into every little problem. Life had its share of troubles, and people handled them in their own way. But the way she had shrunk into herself, the way her hands trembled just before she turned to re-enter the dining room, it wasn't just frustration. It was hurt. Clint shifted his weight slightly, still unnoticed. He could have ignored it, taken a quiet seat in the back, let the night go on as usual. But that wasn't how he worked. His instincts told him there was more to this, and when Clint Eastwood got that feeling, he didn't just walk away. But before he could act, he caught a hushed conversation between two nearby employees, words that made the pieces start falling into place. Clint remained still, his sharp eyes fixed on the waitress as she hurried toward the kitchen doors, her face turned away from the crowd. She wasn't just upset, she was trying to disappear. He wasn't the only one who noticed. Two employees, a busboy and another waitress, stood near the bar, their conversation hushed but urgent. Clint wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but in a room like this, where voices blended into the ambient hum, certain words had a way of cutting through the noise. "That guy's been on her case all night," the young man muttered, shaking his head. "I know she's new too. Just started last month," the other waitress whispered back. "It's disgusting. And nobody's saying a damn thing." Clint's jaw tightened slightly. Nobody's saying a damn thing. He shifted his gaze toward the dining room, scanning the tables. Who was responsible? The restaurant wasn't a fancy white tablecloth kind of place. It had character, a rustic warmth that made people feel at home. But there were always a few customers who mistook good service for servitude. The kind who thought a tip gave them the right to demean the person bringing their food. And then Clint saw him. A middle-aged man, maybe late 50s, sat at a corner table, relaxed in his chair like he owned the place. His blazer was unbuttoned, his tie loosened, and his laughter cut through the air, far louder than necessary. The people at his table, two men and a woman, seemed entertained, though not entirely comfortable. The woman glanced toward the kitchen doors, her expression unreadable. The waitress wasn't at their table anymore, but the way they carried on told Clint everything he needed to know. This wasn't just a bad tipper. This was a man who enjoyed making people uncomfortable, the kind Clint had spent a lifetime despising. His hands slid into his pockets as he turned back toward the kitchen. He didn't need to guess what had happened. He already knew. The details would come soon enough. Right now, there was only one thing on his mind. That waitress was in the back crying, and Clint Eastwood wasn't about to let that stand. But before he made his move, he caught sight of the girl stepping back onto the floor, her shoulders squared, her face composed as if nothing had happened. Clint watched as the young waitress stepped back into the dining area, moving carefully, like someone walking on broken glass. Her hands were steady, her face unreadable, but her eyes carried a weight no one should have to bear during a shift. She wove through the tables, tray balanced on one arm, stopping just short of the loud man's table. Clint noticed how her posture stiffened, how she inhaled a deep breath like she was bracing for impact. The man didn't look at her at first. He was mid-conversation, waving a hand in the air as he exaggerated some story that had his companions half smiling, half enduring. But the moment he turned his head and saw her standing there, a slow smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. Look who's back," he drawled, leaning back in his chair. The woman at the table looked away. One of the men checked his watch, suddenly interested in the time. Clint saw it clearly now, the silent bystanders. The ones who heard every word but decided it was easier to pretend they hadn't. "You forget how to do your job, sweetheart?" The man continued, taking a lazy sip of his drink. The waitress didn't flinch. She simply set a fresh glass of water in front of him. "There you go, sir," she said quietly. "Oh, so now you're polite." He laughed, shaking his head. Then, turning to his friends, he said, "See, all it takes is a little coaching. You push him enough, and they figure it out." The waitress gripped her tray a little tighter. Not a single person at the table told him to stop. Clint had seen a lot in his lifetime. Good men, bad men, and cowards who let bad men do as they pleased. And this right here was exactly the kind of thing that got under his skin. But it wasn't over. The man wasn't satisfied with humiliating her once. He picked up his fork, inspected his plate, and clicked his tongue. "You know what? I think you got my order wrong." The waitress blinked. "I'm sorry, sir. You asked for the ribeye. Medium." "No, no, no," he interrupted, shaking his head dramatically. "I said medium rare. See, this is what I mean. You just don't listen, do you?" Clint could tell. The girl knew exactly what was happening. She wasn't confused. She was cornered. "Would you like me to have the kitchen fix it?" she asked, her voice calm, measured. "But what? So now I got to wait another half hour? I swear service these days." He leaned forward, voice dropping just enough to make it personal. "Maybe if you weren't so busy running your mouth, you'd be better at your job." That was when she cracked. Not visibly, not dramatically. But Clint saw it. A barely there hesitation, the way her jaw tightened just slightly before she turned away. The way she disappeared behind those kitchen doors, like she couldn't get out fast enough. That's where he'd found her minutes ago, holding herself together just enough to keep from breaking. Clint had heard enough, but before he could move, the waitress reappeared, walking straight toward that table. No tears, no hesitation, just a quiet kind of determination that told Clint she was ready for round two. Clint had seen enough. He wasn't the kind to get involved in every little dispute. But this wasn't just a bad customer. This was a man who thought power came from making others feel small, and that didn't sit right with him. He rose from his chair, moving slowly, deliberately. No one had recognized him yet, and he intended to keep it that way, at least for now. His steps were silent against the wooden floor, but there was weight behind them. The waitress was already at the table, standing stiffly as the man smirked up at her. "Took you long enough," he muttered, swirling the drink in his glass. "What? You go cry in the back before coming out here?" Clint saw the slight tremor in the girl's fingers as she set down the replacement plate. Then, before she could step away, the man reached. Not aggressively, not violently, but just enough, a hand hovering near her wrist. A move so slight it could be excused as an accident if called out. She flinched and that was it. Clint's voice cut through the air like a blade. That's enough. It wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. The entire restaurant seemed to still in an instant. The man froze mid-smirk, confused at first. Slowly he turned his head, eyes landing on Clint. Just another old-timer in a plain jacket. And who the hell are you? He scoffed, chuckling as he leaned back. Got yourself a little hero complex, pal. Clint didn't blink. He didn't move. He didn't have to. No, Clint said, voice steady. Just a man who doesn't like bullies. The laughter at the table died. The waitress took a step back, pressing the tray against her chest. She didn't speak, didn't move, like she couldn't believe what was happening. The man's smirk faltered for half a second before coming back, forced this time. You serious over a waitress? He sneered. You got no idea what you're talking about, old man. Clint tilted his head slightly, studying him. I know exactly what I'm talking about, he said. I watched you run your mouth all night, saw you humiliate someone just trying to do their job, and now you're sitting there thinking you're untouchable. The man scoffed, shaking his head. You got some nerve? Clint took a step closer. No, he interrupted, voice dangerously quiet. You do. The air in the room changed. It wasn't loud, it wasn't aggressive, but it was final. The man opened his mouth, but no words came out. For the first time that night, he looked uneasy. His eyes darted to the people around him because suddenly he realized they were all watching. The waitress wasn't alone anymore. And neither was Clint. But before the man could make a choice to fight back or back down, one of his own dinner guests shifted uncomfortably in their seat, and the tension at the table cracked. For a brief moment, the man looked around as if expecting someone, anyone, to step in and break the tension. But no one did. The restaurant had gone eerily quiet. Every conversation stalled. Every fork paused midair. His friends at the table weren't laughing anymore. The woman shifted in her seat, eyes darting between him and Clint. One of the men cleared his throat and reached for his drink, suddenly finding the bottom of his glass more interesting than the scene unfolding before him. The man straightened, rolling his shoulders as if that might shake the unease creeping up his spine. His bravado was slipping, but he wasn't ready to let it go. Not yet. You got a problem, old man? He asked, voice lower now. Clint didn't answer right away. He let the silence stretch, his gaze steady, unwavering. The weight of that stare, the kind that had unsettled far tougher men in his lifetime, seemed to land squarely on the man's chest. His fingers drummed once against the table before he scoffed and leaned back, forcing out a chuckle. This is ridiculous, he muttered, shaking his head. All this over some. Clint took another step forward. Just one. Careful, he warned. The single word landed like a hammer. The man's mouth snapped shut, and for the first time all night, he looked uncertain. Clint didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to threaten. The weight of his presence of the moment was enough. The man exhaled sharply, eyes flicking toward his friends again, as if hoping for support. The woman gave him a look, one that said she was embarrassed for him. The other man finally spoke, clearing his throat. Let's just eat, he muttered, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. That was it. The shift, the moment of recognition. The man might have been arrogant, but he wasn't stupid. He could feel it the way the air had turned against him. He wasn't the one in control anymore. He let out a forced chuckle, reaching for his drink. Whatever. Not worth the damn trouble. But Clint wasn't done. Apologize, he said flatly. The man nearly choked on his drink. Excuse me? You heard me, Clint said. His voice never rose, never wavered. You spent your night tearing her down. Now you're going to look her in the eye and apologize. The man laughed again, but this time it was weaker. The kind of laugh someone gives when they know they've already lost. The waitress, who had been silent the entire time, barely breathed. The man shifted, tapping his fingers against the table. Eyes flicking between Clint and the others around him. He was weighing his options, realizing he didn't have many. Finally, he exhaled sharply, not out of remorse, but because he knew there was no way out. Fine, he muttered, barely looking at her. Sorry, Clint didn't move. The waitress swallowed hard. She stood tall, but Clint could see it. The exhaustion, the humiliation, the way she was bracing for more. "That's not an apology," Clint said. The man's jaw clenched a long silence. Then finally, begrudgingly, he lifted his gaze to her. "I'm sorry," he said, slower this time. It wasn't much, but for the first time tonight he meant it. Clint held his gaze for a second longer before finally stepping back. The restaurant seemed to exhale all at once. Conversations resumed in hushed murmurs. Forks clinked against plates again, but nothing would go back to normal. Not completely. But before Clint could leave, the waitress turned to him, her voice quiet but steady. The waitress hesitated, gripping the tray in her hands as if anchoring herself to the moment. Her eyes met Clint's, still carrying the weight of everything that had happened. But now there was something else. A quiet strength. "Thank you," she said. Her voice steady but soft. Clint gave a small nod, barely more than a shift of his head. He didn't need thanks. This wasn't about him. The man at the table, still brooding, exhaled sharply and muttered something under his breath. His meal sat in front of him, untouched now, appetite soured by his own actions. His companions weren't rushing to defend him anymore, their discomfort lingering like smoke after a fire. One of the restaurant's managers finally appeared. A wiry man in his 50s, his eyes flicking nervously between Clint and the scene that had just unfolded. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, Clint glanced at the waitress. "You good?" he asked, his voice low. She hesitated for just a second, then nodded. "Yeah." That was enough for him. He turned, ready to leave, but the manager took a step forward, clearing his throat. "Mr. Eastwood." Clint stopped, giving him a look that made the man rethink whatever corporate platitude he'd been about to spill. Instead, the manager shifted gears, glancing toward the table. "We don't tolerate behavior like that in this restaurant," he said quickly. "That man should leave." The waitress stiffened, and for the first time, Clint saw something flicker in her expression, something close to frustration. She looked at the manager, then at the man who had humiliated her, and in that moment, she made a decision. The table went silent again. Even Clint raised an eyebrow slightly. The man smirked as if she was backing down, but she wasn't. "He can stay," she continued. "But I won't be serving him." Her voice didn't shake. There was no hesitation. She was drawing the line herself. The manager hesitated, then nodded. "Understood." Clint watched the man at the table. Saw the flicker of something. Maybe shame, maybe just irritation that he no longer had the power in the situation. Either way, it wasn't his concern anymore. He reached into his jacket, pulled out his wallet, and placed a crisp $100 bill on the counter nearest to him. Not as charity, as recognition for good service, he said simply. The waitress swallowed hard, but she nodded, and with that Clint turned and headed for the door. The air outside was cool against his skin as he stepped onto the sidewalk. He hadn't come here looking for trouble. He never did. But sometimes trouble found the wrong person. And when that happened, Clint Eastwood made damn sure it didn't go unanswered. Life's full of people who think power comes from putting others down. But real strength? It's in standing up even when no one else does. If you believe in respect and standing for what's right, share this story. Let's remind people that kindness isn't weakness and respect isn't optional. Subscribe for more powerful stories.